Senator Gallagher, you have 4 minutes.
Minister, you're very welcome to the House this afternoon. Minister, there are 4 state contracts currently underway in Monaghan Town. All 4 state contracts have been secured by contractors from outside the state. I understand, of course, the requirements of the state tender process. But, Minister, is there a need for a review of that process to ensure absolute fairness? Local people in Monaghan are naturally asking questions about the process that resulted in this happening and whether it is truly fair and just. They are asking questions, is it not strange in the awarding of 4 state contracts that not one contractor from Monaghan was successful? After all, they employ local people, they buy their materials from local suppliers, and they all pay rates. People need assurance that the current system of assessment are truly effective. They need to be assured that the same criteria are fairly used for all tenders. There needs to be absolute assurance that there are no loopholes. That is, that the current criteria of the tender process does not allow contractors from outside the state any unfair advantage. Are there adequate inspections during the term of such contracts, both during the contract and indeed at the end of such contracts, to ensure that criteria have been adhered to by the successful contractors? People need to be and must be assured that there is a level playing pitch and that the Department is doing all it can to make sure that that is the case.
Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. And I'm taking this commencement matter on behalf of my colleague Paschal Donoghue, TD, the Minister for Finance and Public Expenditure and Reform. Public procurement is obviously a key part of the Government's overall reform agenda, and the procurement process is governed by EU legislation and national rules and guidelines. And the aim of these rules is to promote an open, competitive and non-discriminatory public procurement regime which delivers best value for money. It's important to point out that this regime works also to the benefit of Irish suppliers wishing to supply goods, services or works in other EU member states. When carrying out procurement procedures, contracting authorities require suppliers to comply with a wide variety of legislation in areas that would include taxation, social policy, the environment and employment law. And compliance with the legislation covering these areas is rightly a matter for the relevant departments and or agencies that are involved in the particular procurement process. Public procurement regulations require applicants to meet certain standards when applying for public contracts, and that applies across the board. The criteria upon which contracting authorities may exclude applicants from the award procedure of public contracts are set out in the European Union Award of Public Authority Contracts regulations and the EU Public Procurement Directives of 2014. Before an applicant in relation to certain breaches is excluded, they may make a case and provide supporting evidence as to why it should not be excluded, and the contracting authority must consider this evidence before deciding whether to exclude or include an applicant. In addition, the qualifying tenderer must submit signed declarations stating that none of the circumstances, for example participation in a criminal organisation, corruption, terrorist offences, etc., outlined in Article 57 of the Procurement Directive apply. Contracting authorities may also require applicants for public contracts to declare that they have not breached their obligations in the fields of environmental, social and labour law established by the Union law, European Union law, national law and collective agreements, or by the international environmental, social and labour law provisions listed in Annex X of the Procurement Directive. These requirements are set out in the template documents used in tendering for goods and services, which have been developed by the Office of Government Procurement in conjunction with the Office of the Attorney-General and the Chief State Solicitor's Office. A comprehensive interpretation of the Public Procurement Directives, Public Procurement Guidelines for Goods and Services, has been developed to improve consistency and to promote best practice in the application of the public procurement rules. In addition to developing guidance and providing advice to contracting authorities, the Office of Government Procurement has responsibility for developing and setting out the overarching policy framework for public procurement in Ireland. And in this regard, the Office of Government Procurement has developed the National Public Procurement Policy Framework, which consists of 5 strands: legislation, government policy, capital works management framework for public works, general procurement guidelines for goods and services, and more detailed technical guidelines, template documentation and information notes as issued periodically by the OGP. This framework enables a more consistent approach to public procurement across the public sector by setting out the procurement procedures to be followed by public bodies. The framework supports contracting authorities, including the 4 key sectors: health, education, local government and defence, individual departments, offices, commercial and non-commercial state bodies and entities which are subsidised 50% or more by a public body when awarding contracts for works, goods and services. It enables public bodies to adopt procedures to meet their public procurement requirements and facilitates compliance with EU and national procurement rules. I will conclude by stating that, while the Office of Government Procurement Guidelines facilitate and enable compliance with public procurement rules, it is the responsibility of each contracting authority to ensure that they adhere to these rules.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Gallagher.
Minister, I would like to thank you for your response. As I am sure you can appreciate, it is very frustrating for a local contractor who sees not 1, not 2, not 3, but indeed 4 contracts going to contractors from outside the state. Bearing in mind that these jobs are not overly big to start with, and it is very frustrating for people that are left scratching their heads and wondering how come their tender was not successful. And I understand what you are after saying there, but I think it is important that the rules and guidelines that I have no doubt are in place in relation to the awarding of these contracts. I think the last paragraph of your response, and indeed the last line of your response, is where perhaps the key to this is, and I quote, "It is the responsibility of each contracting authority to ensure they adhere to these rules." And I would like, Minister, an assurance from yourselves that there are adequate checks and balances in place to ensure that the contracting authority are doing what they are meant to be doing. That is ensuring that the people that are successful in these contracts, and good luck to them, are adopting the same rules and regulations as all others are as well.
Thank you, Senator Gallagher. Minister.
Thank you. Yes, and I would agree wholeheartedly with the Senator in requiring that every single contractor tendering for a project here in Ireland, irrespective of where they emanate from, are subject to the same sets of terms and conditions and are required to comply with all of the regulatory regime underpinning the contracting process here in Ireland. Just in relation to the oversight which you refer to in your final response, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform requires those charged with the delivery of public works to comply with the Public Spending Code and Capital Works Management Framework, and that sets out the high-level principles which apply in relation to project governance, in particular the procedures that must be followed by bodies with delegated sanction for capital expenditure, those being the awarding bodies I referred to earlier on. All projects are required to complete the review stages set out in the Code before sanction is given to go to tender, and that process is undertaken between the sponsoring agency and the sanctioning authority. Just in relation, and it's a topical and a timely intervention on the part of the Department, our review of the Public Spending Code is currently underway in the Department, and as elements of the review are completed, the associated updated guidance will be published, and work is ongoing on updating the requirements in relation to the different stages involved in the process of selection, appraisal, approval and delivery of capital investment projects, and that review of the Public Spending Code will be completed in the first quarter of this year.
Thank you very much, Minister.